My name is Roland Kelts. I'm the author of a book called Japan America, How Japanese Pop Culture Has Invaded the US. We don't use the word invaded in the Japanese edition for a lot of obvious reasons. Really delighted to be here today. Really happy to be. It's my second time in Otakon, and this is the 20th anniversary of this amazing convention. So I want to thank the people who organize it for inviting me here, and I want to thank you for coming out today to talk a little bit about these two industries, anime and Hollywood. First of all, how many of you would like to see more anime titles turned into Hollywood films? Raise your hand. That's pretty good. I thought there'd be a lot of boos.
If they're done right.
Which titles would you like to see? Just doing a canvassing. Which titles would you like to see Hollywood take on? Anime originals that you'd like to see the industry out in California try to remake. Go ahead.
I'd like to see what it'd be like if they try to see Evangelion.
Evangelion in Hollywood. Scary. You're a brave man. How about somebody else? Yeah.
Cowboy Bebop.
Cowboy Bebop. That's an interesting title because in so many ways Watanabe-san was sort of, riffing on Hollywood themes with Cowboy Bebop. One more. How about anybody else? Yes. Akira. Well, that's been sitting on a lot of desks for a long time. Leo DiCaprio threw a lot of money at that, but it's still not being made. It was going to be made in Neo Manhattan, by the way. Until it got shelved.
A good campy Lupin the Third.
Lupin the Third, you think, would be good. Okay, well, all right, we're going to move on here. We'll talk about this a little more later on. I wanted to, first of all, try to define these two industries, which, as you know, they're sort of seen as one versus the other. In other words, anime itself is considered Japanese, aesthetically and intrinsically, and Hollywood, obviously, American. Neither is true. Neither is true. Hollywood has never been simply an American form of storytelling. It's a polyglot form. It's very much like America itself, made up of numerous different voices, cultural aesthetics, coming together to produce a form of entertainment, which is in itself a polyglot form of entertainment. But anime is also not exclusively Japanese. And I post here the image of the god of manga, the god of anime, really. And who's this guy?
Osamu Tezuka.
Osamu Tezuka. And what's his most famous creation?
Astro Boy.
Astro Boy, right? And Astro Boy, obviously, for Japanese of a certain generation, was to some extent the expression of the industry in the same way that Mickey Mouse became the expression of the Walt Disney industry in California. But what's interesting about Tezuka himself is that he grew up on Disney's artwork. In fact, he made his own version of Bambi. It's called Bambi by Osamu Tezuka, based on Walt Disney. And he also claimed to have seen Bambi 81 times, copying very meticulously the artwork of Walt Disney. One of Tezuka's dreams was to have animation produced that could move fluidly as Disney's animation did. So to call what we call anime and manga purely Japanese art forms is a misnomer. So here I have an example of some Tezuka work. Anybody know where this is from? Ooh, this is like a 50-cent question. Yeah. Very old works from Treasure Island. And if you look very carefully, what you'll see is two aspects of Tezuka's art which help to define what we think of as manga and anime versus American animation or Hollywood filmmaking, which is the art of compression, the art of decompression, of taking an image and opening it up very, very slowly to create drama. And this is partly because of simply a lack of funds in the industry and the use of black and white techniques. So you see where things get slowed down. If you've read manga, if you watch anime, you'll notice that sometimes there's like a jump frame and somebody's face is suddenly close up and then suddenly moves back. And it's all done with this sort of cinegraphic effect, but it's also done in order to save money. Manga is still published in black and white. It's not full color comics like we're used to in the United States. So the artists have to use different techniques in order to create drama. Tezuka pioneered the art of decompression. And here's another, just a sort of a 1, 2, 3 diagram showing you how the easy and economical approach, where you see on the top, the movement is simply repeated over and over. And you get a sense of movement because the image is repeated and jumps across the screen, whereas below, if you try to create the completely fluid movement, which we're accustomed to in American animation, well, it costs a lot more money because you're having to draw all the in-between frames. So manga and anime, in a sense, develop as a way to save money, and you get this effect when you put it on television.
It says QuickTime not available.
What's that?
It says QuickTime not available.
So is there another way to see it?
Do you have the video file itself?
It's embedded.
Yeah, it might not work. I was having this problem when I was making a presentation.
Is there any techie in the audience who can get this to work?
Well, the problem is it won't play it because it's embedded, but the thing is, where's the source clip from? Do you have that?
All right, well, if we can get it to play, you'll see what it looks like on television. But for now, it's weird, this played in other formats before. There's no QuickTime. Okay. Let's just see if we can do this.
You hit spacebar.
Okay. Well, obviously, we'll have to see if we can see that clip a little bit later. But what it was going to be illustrating is what you see in anime when you skip between frames. It's called limited animation, and it's something that the Japanese pioneered and still use today in what we call anime. And I want to illustrate that because it's one of the things that Hollywood seems to misunderstand when they try to remake anime. How to produce that effect, which is a visual effect. It's very kinetic, and yet it was achieved in part to save money. The other very dramatic impact on Japanese artists is obviously World War II, which, now we're talking about a certain generation of Japanese artists, but that helped define what we know of as anime today. This is just a photograph showing you the effect of the fire bombings in Tokyo. A lot of press is naturally given to the atomic bombs, which were certainly devastating in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but many, many millions more died in the firebombing campaign of 16 cities in Japan. My mother was a little girl in the underground bomb shelters in Tokyo when the city was firebombed in March of 1945, March 10th of 1945, the day before, somewhat sadly and ironically, the disaster that struck Japan in 2011. March 10th, 1945 was the first firebombing of Tokyo. So Japanese artists, Tezuka, Miyazaki, Hayao, Otomo, a generation of Japanese artists was affected by the war. and one take on the difference between the triumphal, superheroic tone of American comics in the post-war era versus the comparatively melancholic, perhaps you could say quizzical tone of Japanese comics, manga, and anime after the war, is that one was the art of the winner and the other was the art of the loser. Astro Boy himself is quite different from Mickey, after all. Mickey is plucky, always telling everyone to buck up, things are going to turn out okay. If you've seen Astro Boy or read the manga, you know that he's a very mixed up little half-robot boy who isn't quite sure what he's here for. So there's a very pronounced difference in the aesthetic and the storytelling that emerges in Japan and that emerges in the United States. Obviously, this is from
Fireflies.
Grave of the Fireflies, right? Which has been called by critics worldwide not only a great work of animation, but a great film. And this is largely what Studio Ghibli, Miyazaki Hayao, he's the most famous director from Studio Ghibli, but the studio that was founded by him and his partners in the 1980s. Miyazaki, if Tezuka pioneered manga and animation on television, Miyazaki Hayao pioneered its move into the cinema. And that was his goal. He actually worked for some time, some of you may know this, Miyazaki worked for some time for Disney in California. He lived in California, and so he soaked in some of what the movie industry was about in the United States. When he went back to Japan, he was determined that animation should move from television into the cinema. For one thing, he couldn't stand the limitations of TV, the under 30-minute programming timelines, the commercials, the incredibly low fees that Japanese networks pay to animation studios, which is still true today, sadly, often called the curse of Osamu, because Tezuka sold his work very, very cheaply, and that curse, sadly, is still in effect today. Miyazaki hated all these things. He ended up dismissing Tezuka. It's very sad in a way. Even though when he was a young man, Miyazaki studied Tezuka's work, later he found that Tezuka was in effect too crude a storyteller and too cheap an artist for his taste. So Miyazaki and his studio Ghibli, and this clearly one of their greatest films, Grave of the Fireflies. If you've never seen it and want to understand not only the art form and how it developed, but also the influence of the war on this generation of artists, I strongly urge you to see this film. I think it's a masterwork. So if that pioneered the move into the cinema if Studio Ghibli pioneered that move into the cinema, suddenly you start getting this, what I call in Japan America, the book, a Mobius strip of influences, where you can't start not being able to tell which side is up and which side is down. The influences are transcultural, they're transgraphical. Here you have very obvious juxtaposition. The top is from
Blade Runner,
right? And the bottom is from
Akira.
And one of the things that is extraordinary about the urban cityscape in Japan, I had a friend who brought his son to Japan. His son was a huge manga and anime fan, and his son was looking out the window of the limousine bus on the way into Tokyo, and his son said, "Oh my God, it really looks like that." Japanese cities, in part because of the speed with which they were developed after the war, in part because of a very different set, some would say non-existent set of zoning laws, the juxtaposition of buildings and their directions and their shapes and their containments. You know, in Tokyo, even today, you can find a pachinko gambling parlor next to a lotteria hamburger shop, next to an adult video store, and right behind that, a little Shinto shrine. In one, probably what would be like a quarter of a block in New York City. I mean, it's that dense, it's that intense, and it's that polyglot. There's so many things in so many little spaces. And as you can see, and one of the brilliant things about Akira, I think, that is achieved through layers of imagery. If you watch Akira today, and I think Funimation's about to come out with the 25th anniversary DVD, which is probably, it's going to look incredible. You can see the effect of this layered approach. What I was talking about earlier, the decompression effects of Tezuka, using frames upon frames rather than fluid movement to create a sense of kinetic energy. And you can get a little of that. Unfortunately, since none of these video clips are probably going to work, I can't show you that. But you can see, even with this illustration, the buildings layer upon layer, and how those, if you just move those layers of buildings, you get a sense of movement and energy and excitement without creating the fluidity of Disney, which in a way doesn't create the same kind of kinetic energy. It's a different kind of energy. And then, of course, Blade Runner, I mean, the layers of buildings here, and obviously the image of a modified geisha on the side of one of the buildings echoes Japanese aesthetics and cityscapes. And the other impact, obviously, which we've talked about before, Japanese art, which emerges from traditional Japanese artwork, is the preference or the aesthetic of line work versus three-dimensional or chiaroscuro effects in Western art. Now, again, this is not mutually exclusive. This is not to say that no Japanese artist ever tries to shade in backgrounds or create three-dimensional effects, or that no Western artist emphasizes line art. But comparatively, and this is probably the most famous ukiyo-e print in the world. This is, what? Anybody?
Great Wave off Fujiyama.
Kanagawa, right?
What?
Fujiyama?
Yeah.
No, well, Mount Fuji's in the background, but the wave itself is off Kanagawa, the district.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, you're fine. It's definitely commonly known as the Great Wave, right? And the reason I throw it up here today, I'm sure many of you have seen it, but if you just look at the edges of the foam itself and see the energy contained in the lines of the outlines of the foam, and you see how little is done to create a standard or classic sense of three-dimensional distance. You can see Mount Fuji back there. And one of the interesting things about this image, and I think speaks very much to the Japanese sensibility, is that Mount Fuji is clearly one of the primal symbols of Japan, has always been a national symbol. And yet, if you look at Mother Nature and the effects of Mother Nature, she completely dwarfs Mount Fuji. And that Japanese sensibility that they're on an island that is buffeted by typhoons, by earthquakes, by volcanoes, that you're forever enthralled to the power of nature, I think is very well captured in this image, together with the aesthetic of line art. And of course, there's another ukiyo-e print, which can illustrate not only the use of outline versus three-dimensional perspective to create the image, but in this case, a hint of bawdiness, of sexuality in a graphic art form, which of course it can be found in manga and anime, and is something that sometimes jars American viewers. How can they show this in a comic book? But in fact, there's a great tradition of showing erotic or bawdy prints in graphic art forms. Ukiyo-e, of course, was a low art form in the 17th and 18th centuries, became a high art form when Westerners put it into museums. Miyazaki himself, I wanted to put this image up here just so that you get a sense of the power of his genius in Japan today. And it's still true. There are many people in the anime industry in Japan who don't like Mr. Miyazaki personally, but every single one of them will concede that he's the greatest artist the Japanese animation industry has ever produced. And that's quite striking. And I mean, there are people who have reason to dislike him immensely because he hasn't treated everybody all that well in his career. And I say that respectfully, but there is no one in Japan who has the power and commands the affection of the Japanese, like Hayao Miyazaki, and that's true inside the industry and outside the industry. Every time he comes out with a new film, it's the top of the box office in Japan. You imagine how incredible that is. I mean, animation in America, we have Pixar. You know, Pixar comes out with its big hits and so on and so forth. But if you had a single director in animation who every time he releases a film, it's the top of the box office. It's pretty extraordinary, I think. And this was a scene from Ponyo, but again, I don't think the video is going to work.
Nope.
So, does anybody know what this scene was? Yeah. It was an incredibly prescient scene. Miyazaki-san, if you've seen Ponyo, there's a scene where a single mother drives up the coastline and is essentially being chased by a tsunami wave. And the car is like screaming up the coast. Her son is in the back seat. And Ponyo, the quasi-fish creature that turns into a little girl, transforms into the girl as the tsunami is rising up to overtake the car. So it's a moment of apocalyptic imagery combined with, you might say, the power of love, or the power of romance. It's an incredible scene, it's beautifully illustrated, it's also beautifully scored, but it ended up being incredibly prescient. This film came out in Japan in 2009. In 2011, literally you were watching on your television sets in Japan, actually around the world, automobiles racing up the coast of Tohoku, trying to escape this enormous tsunami wave that was about to destroy much of northeastern Japan. So it was one of those moments when an artist seems to have almost a sixth sense about the calamity that is about to strike. And I'm sorry I can't show you this scene. Curse QuickTime, I guess. Now, anime in Hollywood is the title of this talk, so let's quickly jump back to the topic at hand. There's Leo in his, I don't know what he's wearing there, but
Vinyl.
Akira, someone mentioned earlier as a title they'd like to see Hollywood remake. Hollywood has been, well, various studios have been allegedly trying to remake it. There have been scripts. They were in pre-production, I think, at one point a couple of years ago. And what was interesting to me, observing this process, is that, and knowing people in California who are involved in it, is that as soon as they decided that they would make it into, set it in New York City, a neo-Manhattan, howls of protest went up on the internet. It was incredible. I was thinking about this because, 25 years ago, if they decided to do that, nobody would even know about it, except a few people who maybe read Variety every day, and wouldn't have any idea. And also, the anime fan base would not be nearly so large and so passionate about what they feel is their own material, in a way. They possess it. Otomo didn't say anything, but as soon as this was announced that they were going to make it in Neo-Manhattan, people were really outraged, and Hollywood, and I say Hollywood as if it's some monolith, people out there paid attention. There was this sense that we better think twice before we set this film in New York City, because maybe there's something about the city in the film that is important to the story. And I think if you've seen Akira, you would argue that's true. That the city is very much a character in the story, and it doesn't look like New York. You can't make it look like New York. It's very much a Japanese, again, as I was saying earlier, this sort of layered and complex cityscape that makes Akira as a story work in animation and, of course, in the original manga. Another example of this is Speed Racer, Mahagogogo, as it was known in Japan. And I don't want to, I mean, we can talk about this, we'll have some time for Q&A and discussion, but I certainly felt that one of the amazing missteps on behalf of the Wachowskis, who are otherwise, brilliant filmmakers in many respects, was making a film based on an animation that was in fact charming because it was so earnest. I mean, if you think back, and I think this is a characteristic of anime, and again, something we can talk about that I think is often overlooked in Hollywood, the assumption is that, oh, it must be hip, it must be cool, young people like it, it's edgy, the illustrations are edgy, so we have to approach it with that snarky Hollywood sarcasm. When you actually look at most successful and most beloved anime titles and manga titles, what they have at their core is a very earnest storyline. The desire to overcome flaws, the desire to work together as a group or as a team. Of course, that doesn't mean they're not funny, or there aren't moments of irony or even sarcasm at times. But the core, I think, of most successful Japanese animation is this earnest desire, this yearning that comes through in the artwork. And this to me was a perfect example because the original Speed Racer is about a family, right? Mm-hmm. Of course, Speed's a race car driver and he's got this mysterious older brother he doesn't know, and there's all this other stuff going on. But it's a story about a family. In fact, the Yoshida brothers said that their influence was Father Knows Best, an American television show. Some of you probably never heard of it. It's a very old American television show about a family. They said the design of Speed was based on Elvis Presley and Viva Las Vegas. Talk about earnest, right? And the story was Father Knows Best, and the car was James Bond. Forget which film now, where he has there's all the buttons and stuff.
Thunderball?
Is it Goldfinger? It's Goldfinger, okay. Yeah. So there's their influence, and they create out of this Speed Racer. And then the Wachowskis come along, and I just thought they turned it into like an overlong music video. And to me, missed the point of the earnestness of the original. I put this up there because another example of a Hollywood remake, this one, of course, of Astro Boy. Unfortunately, the studio, Imagi, which was based in LA and Hong Kong, really ran into a lot of financial problems. And I think this is another example where, the Hollywood approach is to try to make a CGI quasi three-dimensional version of something that moves and looks a lot better in 2D. The original Astro is a two-dimensional character, and again, the heart of the story is the earnestness and the confusion in some respects of the character versus what they ended up with. And I have to add this because there was a lot of back and forthing between Tezuka Productions and Imagi Studios about the character design. And what do you notice about the difference between these two characters in terms of design? What about the eyes?
His are a lot smaller.
Yes, a lot smaller. Yeah, and so what is the impression it gives you?
He's
Evil.
angrier and edgier.
Yes, good, that's really well put. He's angrier and edgier because Hollywood wanted the, 12 to 14 age group? They said, we need the 12 to 14-year-olds and their dads will bring them. So even though Tezuka Productions was saying, that's not Tetsuo and Adam, that's not Astro Boy. He's a boy. He's a little boy. That's the point. Hollywood insisted, no, we have to go over after that age group. Again, I mentioned that term earnestness. I think once you start screwing with the characters in order to achieve some kind of snarky, edgy, angry, whatever you're after, you lose what was the appeal in the first place. Obviously, this one many of you know about. I actually would argue that The Matrix was the most successful Hollywood adaptation of anime because, in effect, it's a beautiful homage to anime. It's an honoring of the effects of Japanese animation, the skill, the achieving the effects that are so powerful in Japanese animation. It's with the Matrix, and that absolutely now classic scene of Keanu dodging the bullet is another example of what I showed you earlier and talked about decompression in Tezuka's work, slowing everything down so that you see frame by frame the action, and it creates this kinetic energy that you wouldn't have if it were just fluid. And that's a brilliant, I think, adaptation of anime techniques in a Hollywood film. This is, anybody know what this is?
Perfect Blue, Black Swan.
Black Swan, yes. Some of you probably familiar with the ongoing, how should I call this? The defense of the great Satoshi Kon, the great late Satoshi Kon, anime director who sadly died a couple of years ago, right? Was it a couple of years ago? 2 or 3 years ago. Was 46 years old, is brilliant. If you've never seen Satoshi Kon's work, I, again, highly, highly recommend it. The last film he made was called Paprika, and a lot of folks found similarities between that and a film called Inception. Leave that up to you. This on the left is an incredible scene from one of his earlier films called Perfect Blue, about a Japanese pop idol who clearly is having problems and is in trouble, and it becomes very, very psychologically terrifying in a way. You can see, this is a scene-by-scene comparison. Yeah, no discussion, right? The scene from Black Swan, which clearly was lifted directly from Satoshi Kon's Perfect Blue, and I would again say much more effective in the former version. Here we have the Inception scene on the right, and the scene from Satoshi Kon's earlier film, Paprika, on the left. Hey, just curious, are you familiar with Satoshi Kon? People here? Oh, good, okay, good, because he's not to be missed. Millennial Actress is just incredible, novelistic animation. Just to go back to the anime Hollywood riffing, I don't know how anyone at Disney can say with a straight face that The Lion King has nothing to do with Jungle Story, Jungle Taite. There are many more examples of these scenes. What's interesting to me about this story is that when I interviewed people at Tezuka Productions about this debate, about this discussion, Shimizu-san, who worked with Tezuka directly, said to me with a straight face, he said, listen, if Tezuka were alive today, he would be honored that Disney took his work and copied it. He would be honored by the imitation because he grew up as a young boy after the war imitating Disney. So for him, it would have been an honor. Now, Tezuka's not alive to tell us that exactly, but that's what Shimizu-san said. The other aspect of the story I find very interesting in terms of anime in Hollywood is that the Tezuka Productions actually went to Los Angeles to meet with the people at Disney to discuss this apparent confusion of whatever was going on. And the Disney people apparently gave them a bunch of gifts, I don't know, swag or something, I don't know, posters, and sent them flying back to Japan. And the people at Tezuka Productions today told me the one mistake that they made was not going to the media. They learned at that point that in America, if you've got a complaint, go to the media. Because if CNN says, oh my God, looks like Walt Disney Productions has copied a Japanese movie, then something might happen. There might be a protest. Lawyers might call you up. But if you actually just go face to face, as you would in Japan, nothing happens. So it's an interesting transcultural story that I don't even know if the anime industry's learned from it today. They still don't have very good legal representation. And then Pokemon. Of course, I realized nobody mentioned Pokemon in terms of Hollywood making more out of anime. No. Yes, I know why. Pokemon, though, is undeniably a watershed moment for Japanese animation reaching a mainstream audience in the United States and elsewhere. It introduced generations of non-Japanese to a lot of what I've been telling you, the decompression, the, to some extent, more elaborate storytelling where you have characters that are, I think they're up to 500 and some pocket monsters now, maybe it's 600, 629.
649.
Forget it, I'm totally dated. All right, they'll be at 1,000 soon. Anyway, you can add more characters. I mean, it's really very interesting to look at Pokemon, the Pokemon template next to Tom and Jerry, right? Yeah. Cat and a mouse, and they beat each other and they chase around, they look for ham. Pocket monsters, right? I mean, whatever you think of Pokemon, it's this incredible universe of ever-expanding, you know, Shinto-like animistic creatures that develop and emerge, and the story goes on and on and on. But I use it here partly to also note that aesthetic that I talked about in Tezuka and in Ukiyo-e is right there in Pokemon. Two-dimensional, line-based illustration. You know, if you look at Pokemon's most famous graphic, the decisions on the design were based on the outline. And the goal of the artist was to create a character whose outline you could recognize even if it was just a silhouette. And again, this is not exclusively Japanese. You know what Snoopy looks like as soon as you see a silhouette of Snoopy, right? So it's not an exclusively Japanese thing. But certainly it's very much a part of the aesthetic. So when you see Pikachu in a stamp, on an outline, on a toilet seat, you know that's Pokemon. Incidentally, Hello Kitty is another great example of that line-based aesthetic, where you don't have any dimensions. She doesn't even have a mouth. And another example of it, nobody mentioned Gatchaman. Gatchaman was another title that was on the docket to be remade in Hollywood. Never got the funding, never got off the ground. Some of you may know it was made into a live-action film in Japan, which was released this summer. So there was a live-action rendering of Gatchaman, and there's still talk of doing that in Hollywood. By the way, if Gatchaman sounds like a completely alien thing to you, it was called Battle of the Planets here in the United States. It was one of those titles in the 1970s that was one of the critical sort of groundbreaking titles in crossing the Pacific. Incidentally, and this is something I write about in the book, but some of you may know Battle of the Planets was heavily butchered by NBC when they showed it on American TV. First of all, the story is that they didn't have anyone in the studio who spoke Japanese. So they were watching these images coming from Japan and they were guessing at the dialogue. I'm not joking. They were making up dialogue to fit the mouth movements because nobody understood Japanese. The other thing was that the original Gatchaman had sexually suggestive scenes, some very violent scenes, and they chopped all that out. And they added another character based on R2-D2 called 7-Zark-7, who would come in, you know, sort of roll across the floor and assure everybody that everything was okay and the team was fine and they would all bounce back next week and have a glass of milk. Don't worry about it. What's interesting now is you can go on YouTube and find some of the comparisons, the original Japanese clip and then the US clip with 7-Zark-7. And there's an amazing DVD box set which somebody sent me as a gift very kindly, where you can watch the original Japanese versions and then pull out the US versions and watch them side by side. And it's a lot of fun. It's actually incredibly edifying if you care about media to see what American media would not broadcast in the 1970s, but the Japanese were okay with. Very, very revealing. So Gatchaman's another one of those titles that may be remade. I'm not going to comment on this, I just put it up there for fun. Nobody mentioned Naruto, but that's another title that is being discussed. In fact, the folks, I've heard the producers of Spider-Man are the ones most heavily pursuing Naruto in Japan. I can't say anything more than that or I'll get shot. But One of the things that I wanted to talk about just in terms of the sense of audience participation, anime in a way, and the anime fan base in Japan and worldwide, I should say, including here at Otakon, is very much about everybody participating, everybody getting involved. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard of the fan artists in Japan, the doujinshi fan art, and it's a whole community of people. The comics market, the Comiket, which is happening, I think, this weekend in Tokyo, gets 500,000 people showing up to celebrate fan art. And that's the model, actually, from the Comiket guidebook, that everybody participates, everybody plays a role. I think one of the great things about American anime cons is the fact that cosplay and staging and performances have become a part of the fan participation versus the Hollywood model, which has been unidirectional by comparison. You go in the cinema, you buy some popcorn, you watch their movie, and maybe you buy a few collectibles, and that's the end of the story. And clearly Hollywood is trying to adjust and adapt to the model that we're all living with today, which is much more audience participation. One of the reasons why the Comic-Con out in San Diego is now, as I'm told, virtually dominated by Hollywood studios, much to the chagrin of a lot of comics fans, is that they're trying to leech that idea. Hollywood is trying to get more involvement for fans, more like what anime has been doing for, arguably, for 40 years. The other question, of course, is the question of copyright. One of my panels this weekend on set tomorrow, and I'm very happy to say I'll be up here, or I don't know which room, but I'll be up somewhere with some people from Crunchyroll.com, and that panel will be about That's a good point. Yeah, you know, I agree with you. I mean, when I first saw it in Tokyo at the premiere, which was on this ginormous screen at Tokyo Dome, and I too was kind of knocked out by what they were able to achieve visually. But you know, it's still 2 hours, right? Like if it were, I don't know, 15 minutes, maybe you'd go, wow, that's an incredible preview of what you're going to do with Speed Racer. But for 2 hours, if you don't develop the core, to me, the core themes of family and longing and brotherhood and trust, it's just effects, you know? Yeah, yeah.
Besides The Matrix, what other live-action adaptations, if any, do you think were successful?
Well, The Matrix, as I made a point, it's not an adaptation, technically. It's an original script, so it's more an homage. Of Japanese, of anime? 0. Yeah, in the back. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. What do you think is going to happen given the fact that Studio Ghibli has been mostly distributed by Disney with The Wind Rises?
What do I think is going to happen?
I mean, do you think that they will give it the kind of release because of the subject matter it's involved in the film with, you know, the creator of Zero? I mean, because they've skirted other things before. We still don't have all the yesterday, all the hype about the nudity and something like My Neighbor Totoro. What do you think Disney's going to do with
My guess is that Disney will do what they usually do, which is basically kick it around for a while, and then until John Lasseter calls them up and forces them to promote it, they won't do anything. I don't think Disney has a vested interest in Miyazaki becoming any bigger than he is. And I think as good as that deal looked in 1996, it's looked just as bad in 2013. It's too bad in a way. I mean, it worked very well for Ghibli when DVDs skyrocketed because Eisner let Ghibli keep the DVD rights. So Ghibli actually was very, very successful after that deal with Disney because Disney distributed all the DVDs, but Ghibli got the rights. And most of Miyazaki's films in the late 1990s and early aughts were because people bought them on DVD. Now, the internet has eaten into those sales, and Disney, like I said, I don't think they lift a finger until Lasseter says, hey, this is a great movie. Do something.
Is it going to be more difficult because of the subject matter?
I don't think so. I mean, it seems to me that this sensitivity over World War II is fading as fast as those generations. And I don't mean this to be cold or cynical, but you know, the US ambassador to Japan goes to Hiroshima every year now and bows his head in honor of those who died. The current US President Obama has expressed a desire to go to Japan and apologize. I mean, that's huge. So I think a film by an animator that talks about the making of the Zero fighter jet, and it's certainly not a pro-war film by any means. I don't think that will affect many sensitivities in that respect. Yeah, sure. Yeah, over there. Oops. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's possible, but I mean, to my mind, the only interesting thing about the Transformer movie is that the cars turn into robots. And Hollywood, what's his name?
Michael Bay.
He has done nothing with that. Just sticking to that very interesting little idea that came out of Takara Tomy, the toy company, and was turned into an animation in the 1980s, that the cars have souls. He's done nothing with it. So I wouldn't trust Hollywood to do much with Gundam, except just take the most basic, interesting idea and try to exploit it. It's too bad. You should be able to do more with Transformers than just repeat that toy. Yeah.
What was the response in Japan to Pacific Rim? Did they like it?
Just came out.
There was some article I read saying that there were some Japanese maybe creators who had seen it who were saying that they liked it, but the thing is maybe in the Japan Times about that it wasn't as popular necessarily in Japan as maybe Elseworld wanted it to be.
Yeah, I'm sure it probably wasn't as popular as he wanted it to be. But, you know, Hollywood overall is having a tougher time in Japan than they did 10 years ago.
Why it might not be as popular in Japan?
I think there are a couple of reasons. First of all, the Japanese film-going audience has become more and more interested in their own films recently and their own stars, which is not necessarily a bad thing. And so a Japanese remake of a classic Japanese story, etc., might have more appeal than something coming out of Hollywood right now. There's also, I do think, to some degree, a possessiveness about these stories and techniques. You know, tokusatsu, I've written about the whole monster movie thing and the special effects thing in Japan, and Japanese are very proud of that aesthetically. And seeing someone in California throw gazillions of dollars at it as an homage, not necessarily that cool or respectful. Transformers, as far as I know, is not that big in Japan either. And the interesting thing about the Japanese animation industry is that if Pixar releases a movie in Japan, you know, Cars 5 or whatever, and it's CGI and it's 3D, Japanese people will go because it's Pixar. They don't expect anything different. But if an anime studio tries to release a CGI 3D film, this was Shinji Aramaki, who's a great artist, did the Appleseed films, and one of them, Ex Machina, was made with John Woo, and they actually had some Hollywood money behind it. And it's CGI, it's 3D, etc. The Japanese audience said, no, it's not anime. You know what I mean? Like, Pixar can do it because that's their thing. That's the American thing. But as soon as somebody tries to do it domestically, no, people don't go. And it's not, I'm not just making this up. You can read Ni Channel, the big bulletin board in Japan. You can read the comments. And, Japanese otaku are like, never going to go see that. It's really extraordinary. Prejudice, domestic prejudice. Yeah.
How do you feel about kids shows internationally? And that's that is video based, and that art culture that as well.
It's an excellent question. Japan adapting an American show, an American. It's all the nature of the adaptation. How it's done. The great story behind that is the Powder Puff Girls. Anybody know that story? What's his name? The guy who created. Yeah. He openly said he created that show partly as a riff on manga and Japanese anime, and how the cute girls that had all this power and big eyes and so on. Well, it was picked up in Japan, and they were going to remake it for a Japanese audience. And he thought, great, fantastic, because I was kind of riffing on Japanese manga and anime anyway. And when they got the artwork, they said, oh, no, wait, you have to make the legs much longer, and the skirts a bit shorter, and the faces have to be a little cuter. They're not cute enough. They're not charming enough. So in other words, here's this American guy who thinks he's made something modeled on manga and anime, but when it goes back, there's a whole set of aesthetics that have to be redone in order to market to a Japanese audience. So it's funny, there's a degree to which we celebrate this globalization, everybody around the world eats sushi, blah, 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 right? But a California roll is not sushi, right? You don't have avocado in a maki in Japan. So it's not a matter of just one thing going over the ocean or going around the world. It becomes a hybrid, I think. And so if they create a hybrid recreation of Supernatural, maybe it's going to work in Japan. But not everything works. And also the audience is very, in both countries, is very much aware of the transcultural exchange as well. So my guess is most of you, even though you might not think about it, when you're watching anime, there's some aspect of you that wants it to be a little alien. A little bit, you know what I mean? Wants it to have a Japaneseness to it. And to some degree, the Japanese audience is like that too. So if they watch an American TV show and they really get into The Walking Dead, for example, I have friends in Japan who love The Walking Dead. Oh, Walking Dead, yeah. But when they watch it, they love this whole exotic, weirdo thing of Atlanta. I'm not kidding. I mean, they'll tell the accents. They start mocking the accents. What are they gonna do about that? They like the accents and the bars and these guys in jeans, and it's Atlanta. So if you just take Walking Dead and set it in Tokyo, you know what I mean? It doesn't necessarily become a hit in Japan. It's got to have this otherness in a way that's part of the appeal. Yeah, we just got a couple more. Sorry?
Part of the problem with Hollywood trying to adapt manga and anime successfully, so they already have usually a hard time adapting comics and Saturday morning cartoons successfully.
Yep. Oh, so in other words, they already have trouble with comics, period.
Yeah.
Well, the superhero stuff's done pretty well, right?
But yeah, recently, within maybe the last 5 years, things have been okay. But even then, you had that George Clooney Batman, for example.
No, you're right. No, that's true. There's probably a double hurdle there, like you said, yeah.
I've noticed one good example of hybridism has been two American cartoons. The new one is the 2011 version of Thundercats, and another one is the Boondocks. One is the script is written in America, and then Madhouse Studios is the one that animates it. However, this actually really looks good because the animation is quality, and you have an American script that actually is put together pretty well. Do you think that's a good example of how hybridism works?
I definitely think it can be done well. Another example, those are good examples. Another example I would give, did any of you see there was a Batman anime DVD that came out when the movie
Yeah.
Gotham Knights, and there were 5, I think, anime Japanese studios that produced the 20-minute shorts, and I thought a couple of those were just amazing. I mean, they sort of captured this essence inside the Batman that I never even thought about, but was there, and they presented it in clearly Japanese style, and yet it was based on the original Batman comics. So I don't think it's impossible to create a successful hybridization of these two cultures and two cultural stories. I think it's definitely possible. But there has to be, I guess what I would say is I think there has to be a great deal of love involved. I know that sounds really sentimental, but one of the reasons I think The Matrix is such a great homage to anime is because you can tell the guys who made it loved all those things I just talked about. Two-dimensional decompression, slowing down the story, using multiple images to create a kinetic energy. They loved it, and they managed to capture it in their own film. So I think that affection for it, and that's some of the problem with Hollywood. If you're just sitting around in California saying, look, this Naruto thing, man, it's really popular. I mean, look at it, it's taken off. Like, get somebody on the phone in Tokyo and let's get that thing out there, right? Then you get the live-action Dragon Ball. Whatever that was. Right? So, if you don't have that affection, it's dead in the water. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know it that well. I actually talked to Stan Lee about that, but I haven't seen it. What do you think? Yeah.
When I watched it the first time, I had no idea what Stan Lee was. All the time thinking, this is very American. I was studying like the feels of this movie, just like some of the examples involved. Then I find out Stan Lee.
Stanley, yeah. Well, Afro Samurai was another one of those attempts at doing a transcultural project, and I think in some ways successful, in some ways not so much. Yeah.
Well, there's Animatrix.
Animatrix.
All right, which was, I guess they asked the Japanese to interpret it in their way, the Matrix.
Yeah, the Wachowskis actually went to Tokyo to help produce that and bring together Japanese animators to make that. Again, I think some were successful, some less so. All right, thank you very much for coming. I think we've got a break. There's opening ceremonies coming up. Really appreciate you coming out today, and thanks for the great questions as well. Thank you.